and I can promise that it is going to be even better now, because it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jaan Valsiner, who is leading cultural psychologist in the world. Jaan is a native Estonian, but he has been working mostly in the US universities. In 1913, he accepted the position of Niels Bohr, professor of cultural psychology at Aalborg University, Denmark. Jaan has very strong connections to Estonian University, particularly to Tallinn University, and we are very happy to learn that starting in December, he will be teaching and doing research at Tartu University. One of the most important landmarks of Jaan's career is the fact that he has been founding editor and editor-in-chief of the journal Culture and Psychology. We all know that many important debates in social and human sciences during the last 25 years have been taking place on the pages of this journal. Jaan has published a number of very important monographs and volumes in the field. I would say that he is a leading figure, together with people like Richard Sveder, Rom Harre, and others, in the so-called counter movement in social and human sciences. While most social sciences are in the business of making complicated things even more complicated, Jaan has managed to make very important steps in the opposite direction. Such steps are particularly important in challenging times we are facing right now, and in the field of migration and integration studies. And that is why we are more than happy to have Jaan as our keynote speaker today. Thank you, Jaan, for joining us, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Raivo. Thank you, Raivo, for the nice introduction. And I will have to try to start my little talk. I hope it works. No, it doesn't work. Yeah.
Yeah, it works.
Can you see it? Yeah.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, good. Very good. So it is my great pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm deeply honored by being invited to a conference as this keynote speaker. Although I was also very troubled about it, because I have never done anything on migration other than migrating myself, very often too much. And also, do I have anything to say from a psychological point of view? On the one hand, it seems there is very much to say. On the other hand, the question is how to say, what to say, and in what order. I'm not so sure I can see. I cannot move my slides, unfortunately, at this moment. Something is wrong. No? No? For some reason, I cannot move my slides back or forth. It's very bad. So, sorry, I'm again in difficulty.
Hi, Jaan. Can we assist you with?
Okay, I see your instruction. I see it. Yeah. Okay, maybe it works now. Yeah.
Are you currently looking at your presentation or conference?
Yes, I'm exactly on my presentation, but for some reason it doesn't move ahead. No, come on. Okay, can you see it now?
We can just see the title slide. If you like, I can share the slides and you can tell me next slide when you wish me to click on to the next.
Wait a second. Maybe here, let me see. Okay, now it seems to work, right?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, sorry to the confusion. So what I'm trying to do in my little talk is to try to understand 4 different issues that are related with migration issues. They may seem extremely simple, I would even say trivial, but I would very much emphasize that behind this triviality is something very deep that requires interest. And the subtitle of this presentation, From Anxieties to Resilience, is probably the key to all of this particular presentation. So this is what I promised you in the particular original promise when I agreed to do the presentation. And as of yesterday, I have even invented the particular slide sequence that you see today. These nice naked people are our very first migrants, whom a very well-dressed gentleman not so politely asks to leave the particular orchard where they have tried to steal some apples. And this has been a theme for all of our Western European type cultural history, where we have been trying to send people out of the orchards and also to get into migration seen from a point of view of genetics. This particular map of genetics, of course, is specific for genetic science, but for us today, it tells us simply about 2 relevant issues. First, that the migration has historically, biologically and historically, been a totally worldwide phenomenon. And second, that interestingly enough, that our geneticist friends, have decided to label the very first haplotypes they have depicted with a nice label of Adam. This is a result of this kind of genetic migration for our Finno-Ugric tribes. Very interesting in itself how they managed to settle in different parts of the Eurasian continent. But this again is very far from our psychological take. This is closer. The genetic reality of migration may actually override all of our racial, ethnic, and other prejudices, which is a very nice development, or would be very nice development in contemporary society. But it leads to interesting issues. While politically correcting one of our prejudices and proudly stating Black Lives Matter, which is very functional nowadays, the depiction of this kind of Adams leaving the paradise have been interestingly not given in the racial adequate way. So in all, the first conclusion from what I'm saying today, that we are all black. If Adam started to come out of Africa, he must have been black. So in other sense, the genetic science and our cultural historiographic of images of the escape from the paradise are slightly in a mutual conflict. Now, having come from one trivial issue, which may not be so trivial, I come to the second one, and I ask a naive question as a psychologist would ask, what do we mean by migration? For you, it is not a question because it is a given. For me, it is still a naive question. Migration is obviously movement, but probably not simply a movement of one ball into another location. Maybe this movement, where a particular ball changing a position, changes also its quality. And I don't know whether these kinds of metamorphosis of balls can actually represent any aspect of migration. Now, however, we come closer. Maybe this is a movement. Maybe the ball rolling down a slide gives us a movement or migration. No, it's simply gravity. However, there are people depicted in this particular slide who purposefully climb a mountain in order to do the mostly useless thing of sliding down of it. And this becomes an extremely important personal activity for many people. Therefore, maybe migration that slalom skiers as well as downhill skiers are used to qualifies as a form of migration, a micro-migration perhaps. The psychology of downhill skiers has been completely understudied in psychology. I have yet to see one study which is dedicated to the study of downhill skiing, although this particular habit is widespread all over Central Europe and very highly appreciated. Or this one, maybe the movement the other way around is migration. Again, a ball moving upward on a slide by itself is an impossibility, unreal. But then you could see people, in this case, Japanese people trying to climb Mount Fuji. They are going up as tourists in a big wave. What would make people to climb mountains? The only way they can end up is to climb down the same mountain. But somehow this temporary migration upwards is psychologically very central for very many. Some climb Mount Fuji, some climb Mount Everest, some climb Munamägi. Whichever one mountain we climb, we still do something that is counter-gravitational and could be seen as a particular act of migration, even if as a very minimal one. Now, for psychology, of course, in all of this simplified version of migration, there is one key issue. What happens in the process? And it's exactly here where all kinds of socially produced anxieties in large groups or in individuals actually take place. It is not a neutral process at a particular object, person, society, group moves from one location to another, changing itself. This becomes an enormous social issue, political issue in different ways, almost guaranteed to happen in any society at the present time or in history. So there are, of course, various forms of migration. Nowadays, with our fascination of washing hands and wearing masks, our temporary migration of home and school and home and work are modified. So our migration from a home to work happens between one room and another room in our apartments. Episodics, of course, we have traditions of holiday migrations, pilgrimages, and of course going for seasonal guest work in another country. Temporary or long-term, so to say permanent, immigration, which may be voluntary or involuntary. So all of these come with a particular package of psychological issues that are not only for the people who migrate, but also for the ones who do not migrate, but see the migrants coming in. So each of these forms have different psychological sets of conditions, as I said. And important from my point of view here is that all of them are in principle non-prepared. When migration happens, it is entrance into innovation, entrance into something new, which cannot be predicted. And Peter Bruegel, back in 1565, described that very well in his talk about 68, blind leading the blind. Only here the blind can be seen both as migrants as well as the ones who see migrants coming in. In both sides, they are at least temporarily blind to the all complexity of the issues that this big migration issue brings. So, second conclusion of my talk is therefore very simple. Migration is confusing for all sides. But stating that something is confusing is not satisfactory. We need to go on from that. because confusion exactly leads to anxieties, but it also leads to opportunities and all kinds of needs for support. And this is, of course, what psychologists will be happy, because all confusions lead to the need for the giving support to somebody, even if it's not clear what the support could be. So to modify the previous simple scheme, the movement that we are describing is very carefully watched by the others who are not migrating, and by the system that regulates this particular migrating stream. This results in mutual watchfulness with growth of prejudices and scapegoating, that you see immediately the particular social psychological phenomena of prejudice build-ups, scapegoating the other, finding all kinds of new attributions to explain what is happening in the migrating process, and so on. It also produces new opportunities for us all. So simultaneously with the confusions and the anxieties come opportunities which could be utilized. Let us look at an example let's look at animals who really matter and who need regular caretaking. This is a glorified Estonian cow, the winner of one of the winners of Estonian cow beauty contest, 2019. Cows are very interesting because they need to be milked. So here are other glorified Estonian cows who in 17th of December produced the maximum milk production in Estonia and are therefore glorified as our record cows. But who does the milking? Estonian dairy industry is second best in productive in the European Union, as I learned, after Denmark. And most importantly, its success almost completely depends on the Ukrainian guest workers, who still have competence to milk cows. So Estonian beautiful and productive cows will require Ukrainian guest workers who come from outside of the European Union, need visas and so on, and of course are confronted with new prejudices during our Corona time. So on the one hand, you see immediately the social regulation of guest worker incoming into Estonia coming up under circumstances of confusion, Corona confusion. On the other hand, you suddenly learn, which I didn't know since last year, that Estonian industry, at least one particular part of the industry, the milk industry, is completely dependent on these guest workers, and who have been coming already years. So the system of temporary migration has been worked in very well, and at the same time, under times of confusion, it suddenly starts to crumble. The government starts to wonder whether we can let them in. The government starts to suggest that Estonians start to milk cows, which is a very complicated task already, and many people who are unemployed would not do it. So in other sense, there is suddenly a confusion and risk to the industry that works very well in Estonia. So in other sense, migration entails intergroup distinctions making, which before that may have been not so strong. This with all aspects, glorification, denunciation, segregation of outgroup from in-group, and so on. We see all these processes today in Europe between different countries. The European unification idea is seriously challenged by exactly this kind of social psychological processes that just spring up when we have these confusing times caused by something we cannot even see. And it leads to all kinds of stronger normative regulations of government side, as well as interpersonal social normative regulations. People lose their friends because become suspicious and acquire new friends who were previously just acquaintances. So the third conclusion of my little talk is actually that migration maintains a need for social sciences to work out solutions for social problems. So the migration, when it's leading to stress, as we have in our present times, suddenly highlights the necessity of social sciences to understand what is happening in a kind of dormant stage where the migration tendencies were not very strong, this could be kind of overlooked because the problems were not right there, economic and other, but now they are right on our fingertips. So, what can psychology then offer the understanding of migration in general? Maybe there are a number of interesting possibilities, but I would emphasize only some today. First of all, when in societal systems, almost certainly the power position of any political kind would tell the migrants who come in, if you come, you must assimilate or don't come. This is a kind of normative imperative that you would see almost anywhere in the world. It may start from the notion of learning the language. It may continue with it. It may link with all kinds of regulations of who can have a permanent living permit in a particular country and so on. What cultural psychology, my specific area, would actually introduce here is something almost the opposite. It is a suggestion to an outgoing migrant. It would take the form of if you go, you not assimilate, but develop beyond the society that insists that you assimilate. And if you think of the latter part, this is exactly when in human history you see migration processes doing. The biggest benefactor of Nazi Germany after 1933 in the sciences was the United States, to where German scientists of Jewish and other backgrounds emigrated. So, in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian mathematicians who migrated to the West made a major contribution to the mathematical sciences in the West. They will not go back because the conditions back in Russia were then and even now not sufficient for the particular development of ideas. So those are Ukrainian dairy workers who come to Estonia. So do students who come to Tallinn University to study and who want to stay after they have finished their information technology studies, for example. This migration is a way to innovate the particular knowledge base of the given society, even though it means that a certain social norm system has to be changed. So this particular perspective has been recently, in the last 3 years or so, developed by a Georgian cultural psychologist, Lado Gamzahurdia, who has developed a new theory of pro-culturation in contrast to the well-known John Barry's theory of acculturation. Acculturation in cross-cultural psychology has emphasized exactly the assimilation of people who migrate from society A to society B with the assumption that they must become participants in society B. In contrast to that, Lado Gamzahurdia's new theory of pro-culturation means that the people who migrate from society A to society B not only take over the best parts of the society B, but develop them further in combination with the background societal context of A into totally new version, which may be personal version or community level version, but nevertheless new version of the particular knowledge base, which could be considered C. So in this sense, the migration processes are not the problem, but the solution to many of the problems that our societies have. And conversely, if the migration tendencies were to end or stopped artificially, then certain developments in the particular so-called receiving countries or receiving societies will become impossible. And in some sense, example of not persuading unemployed Estonians to pick up milking cows is in a way an empirical test of very recent times. So the second scenario that I want to emphasize that cultural psychology probably can contribute is a question of unpathologizing dynamics of society. Now, what do I mean by that? In any society, you would see a particular categorization of different psychological phenomena of individuals or ideological opponents at times as belonging to the other side of a particular border. The border zone is exactly the borderline to pathology. And under our ordinary circumstances, this borderline is not to be crossed, and this kind of methods are introduced in society to curb the possible individual growing pathological tendencies, for example, delusions. 2 or 3 years ago, if you would see somebody in Tallinn wearing a face mask, you would probably think that we are dealing with a delusional or even pathological person, or a Korean visitor, Oriental visitors who are used to being careful about quality of air that they breathe, and wearing face masks has been quite traditional in Oriental societies. When I now go to any European country, if I can, I would see mask wearing everywhere. I see that advertised at all cases. It is an example where a practical measure, indeed, is taken to the level of a psychological delusion and at the same time fortified. As a norm, as a social norm, you must do it, otherwise you will be fined, or otherwise you will be socially stigmatized, whatever. So we are basically living in new societies where the distinction between psychiatric patients and their doctors, psychiatrists, is disappearing when all of them are hidden behind masks. Do the masks work? Yes, of course they do, but not at the level of psychological side only. They work practically in some ways, in some places, but they need not automatically give us a psychological belief that we are winning the war on the virus, because all of the war on the virus is a defensive war. Even the vaccine that we are now getting is a defensive tactic, not an offensive tactic, so to say. So this is an example of what you see under certain circumstances. Under certain social circumstances, what usually would be something to attenuate, namely delusionary thinking that should be going down by some before it reaches a borderline, is actually emphasized. So we need to believe in delusion that all the measures that we take actually work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they can be proven, but nevertheless, we need the particular belief. We need the particular unquestionable belief that the measures we are doing is that. So this leads us to a very interesting general societal issue that goes far beyond our confusions about all kinds of viruses, pandemias, and migration. And it leads to the notion of thinking in society, and thinking that is happening with the help of doubt. In order to think, we need to be able to doubt rather than believe very deeply in something. The moment the belief takes over, or our strong opinions take over, this becomes politically very dangerous, because the strong opinions would clash. They would not talk with one another because they reject the other. So in other sense, there are mechanisms inside the society who both are emphasizing doubt in some places, in some areas, as well as ruling it out. And these two trajectories of dealing with doubt in society operate side by side. In some domains, we are eliminating doubt. In other domains, we are enhancing doubt. So this is quite interesting as a final point of my fourth conclusion about migration. So the notion of the doubt and non-doubt dynamics that I was throwing you last, as well as the notion of the migration leading to innovation rather than a social problem, is actually making migration research very relevant, but not for the solving of the social problems or societal problems, because these are targets of all kinds of political interests, which but directly are not open to any social science application, but rather to basic social science, which is exactly trying to understand how migration operates and how all kinds of confusions that it brings could lead to actually interesting resilience of the very same society that is suffering from all kinds of confusions. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Jaan, for your thought-provoking presentation. Now we will be working like that. There will be questions in chat section, but at this point of time, I don't see these questions. Marie-Lise will explain in writing how I can see, but let us then myself. I will start a kind of general question because what you did, Jaan, you challenged our basic assumptions we take in social sciences, including migration research. Your conceptualization of migration is that there is migration and it is part of innovation. But you didn't talk about the concept and the phenomena of tradition. In sociology, in political science, we see these two phenomena together. They, in a sense, constitute each other. What you were talking about was one side of it, and I see that this might be a kind of problem because contemporary societies are political societies. Political field is a kind of key field in which things are decided, and tradition is a key weapon which is used in politics, in democracy. So far as we live in democracy, we cannot get rid of traditions. And in this context, my question to you is: what about tradition in your scheme? Where does tradition belong in your scheme?
Well, you are exactly right. That is, I did not emphasize tradition in this little presentation. Of course, the tradition is there, and the tradition is something that in all of the decisions processes about emphasis or de-emphasis on doubt, the tradition is the one that actually leads the bifurcation between the two channels, the two trajectories. So given a particular tradition going for 100 plus years in a particular society, the movement towards or against doubt in a particular topic will be catalyzed in one way or another. So I would see the tradition as a catalytic condition for making distinctions between two parallel trajectories on dealing with the thinking processes in society.
Seems that we have lost Ivo, so I can just read some of the questions which have been posted in the chat. Saara Koikalainen is asking, what, in your opinion, can psychology tell us about who migrates versus who does not? And when this is done, this is when this is done voluntarily.
Who migrates, who not, yeah?
Yes.
As I said somewhere in the middle of the talk, migration is obviously a very wide phenomenon, including number of types and number of background structures. So in order to answer this question, I think we have to narrow down which particular forms of migration we are talking about. In some cases, it may be relatively simple. For example, a guest worker deciding to come to Estonia to have a higher salary than in Ukraine may have no difficulty deciding to migrate. Or in Kerala, Indian nurse going to the Middle East may have very little questions about why to migrate. But the question of how to decide to migrate, this becomes psychologically much more interesting, because this involves leaving something behind and entering into something which is totally new and uncertain and very often uncomfortable. And that process, the ability to leave something even temporarily, is exactly what psychology can study. The personal feelings of I am now going to leave my country or my town or my village to go to that other place, another town, another village, another relationship, and so on. These are all issues of leaving and finding. And that dynamics of leaving and finding is universal in very many different ways. You don't even need to look at migration. You can look at people's collections of birthday cards that they have received over years and how easily they are ready to throw any of them out, or how difficult it is to throw out these cards. The cards are simply symbolic markers of somebody close to you performing the ritual to congratulate you on a birthday. You may not even put too much emphasis on the particular card, but when it comes to the idea, I have to throw them away, or I need to throw them away, it suddenly creates a psychological difficulty. And that would be probably the area or the location where I would try to study the initial movement, psychological movement into migration. And that could be an answer to the question. In the cases of economic factors over-determining it, I wouldn't even ask that, because this psychological side can be easily resolved there. But the non-economic migration side would be exactly that psychologists could study in particular ways.
Yeah, I would like to use just my privilege on being on picture. One of your key differentiations was acculturation theory versus proculturation theory, Berry versus Kamsahurdia, and I would like to learn more about what is exactly the difference between these two theories, because a key statement of Berry theory is that there are two important processes, and you need both of these. You need, on the one hand, to preserve your own cultural identity. On the other hand, you need to become part of larger society. So I see there is a kind of dualism here. Both are needed. Now, proculturation, you defined it as not adjusting but developing further. In this process, do you have also this keeping your own identity, or what exactly is this developing further?
The specific unique aspect that Kamsahurdia brings in beyond Perry is exactly in this kind of feeding of the tie with the roots, in what you said before, traditions, into the movement forward to the innovation. It comes from his studies of Georgian students who have come to study in Europe. The Georgian students have very close ties with their mothers. The Georgian cultural history is very strongly linking, especially the young person, male, to the mother figure back in Georgia. Mother figure will maybe concrete mother, maybe a generalized mother, but basically Mother Georgia is behind any movement towards innovation. They want to succeed in the Western societies in their particular professional aspects, but they do it together with a deep loyalty to their mother Georgia. In other sense, the tradition from Georgia does not force them to become fixated on I am Georgian and you don't understand me, I am Georgian in Europe, but rather I am Georgian and I'm going beyond what you in Germany are trying to tell me or what to do. I'm innovating in the sense of synthesizing the Georgian tradition with a new professional development I acquire in my studies in Germany, for example,
Okay,
or in anywhere else.
But in that case,
this means that they're not participating in society. Society is participating in them. That this is probably the main change that I think Amzahurdia, he himself may not agree with that, but I see it happening. We do not participate in society. Society participates in us.
okay.
We go in our lives in a society when society participates in us, for example, Estonian society. We go in our lives between societies. You can travel all over the world. And each of the societies participates in your personal life development. You do not participate in society. This is, in a way, a person-centered view on society, who participates in whom, basically reversed from the traditional notion of societal dominance of a person, restoring the agency to the person. The person, and this comes actually back to the first question in a way, how do people decide to migrate? This is a personal decision after all. The person decides to migrate from Estonia to Finland to do jobs there, for instance. Regularly, irregularly, almost constantly, whatever. So this is basically a personal decision, which is psychological, but it is immediately linked with very concrete societal participation in that particular personal decision.
Yeah, there is a related question from Russell King. He says, I really like the notion of pro-culturation and the follow on the idea that migration is a solution to socio-cultural problems and not the problem itself. Question, does this mean that we should advocate for uncontrolled migration?
Well, who is we?
Nation states.
I am not in a position to make any prescriptive statements to nation states because this is far beyond my function. But if we translate into the notion of nation state, into the role of parents and their communities deciding where their sons or daughters are going to study, then we get indeed a very interesting tension. When my grandfather heard or decided that his son is going to university, his fellow villagers somewhere in northern Estonia said, oh, don't do that. What they end up doing after university, they start stealing horses. My grandfather did not listen to that good advice. My father did go to university, and the result was not really stealing horses. So in other sense, encouraging of controlled or uncontrolled migration carries over at all levels, from personal to societal, from to political. Should or should we not encourage it may depend on the particular conditions to where the migrants may enter. Where would they go? You could consider this, for example, also in higher education context. Going to do studies for PhD is a form of migration. It's a temporary migration into some years in PhD studies, after which something has to happen in human life. That after which is always in question. Academic career tracks are always limited in any societies. The number of doctoral students is increasing in many societies, many countries. How would we restrict the acceptance of doctoral students? How would we encourage them to get the degrees? What is the value of these degrees after they have uncontrolled access? This is an open question for wider societal values as such. So I cannot answer that question.
Thank you. And there is a related question from Leif Kalev, and it reads as follows. Migration is not just a movement of people observed by other people, but a movement influenced by rules and practices of political institutions. There have been more and less successful state and local interventions to the processes of migration. Why do you think we do not need knowledge about these interventions, politics, policy, administration, and governance?
Oh, we need this information. We need this very careful study on this. This is far beyond psychology. In order to make exactly these particular studies very clear, this is something that needs to be very clear because it involves basically the role of bureaucracy in any society, democratic, autocratic, totalitarian, and so on. Because the real political power in any society is in the hands of what we call somewhat in a pejorative manner bureaucrats, or what others call public administrators, which is a nice label of similar kind. So when the analysis of the organizational processes of public administration in this particular context requires exactly the knowledge we need to either encourage, discourage, and so on, personal migration. That is, in other sense, to avoid particular traps in migration, the understanding of the flexibility of the administrative systems, not the fixation, but flexibility. Again, the possibility of opening new loops rather than closing them would be probably the macro social complement to what I'm talking in terms of psychology. But in itself, it is not the role of psychologists to do it.
Thank you. Now there is a question from Richard Croft, which is, as compared to previous questions, very, very supportive of what you said. Thank you for very interesting points and insights. I really benefit from the idea of pro-culturation. So that brings up a question to what extent is integration a secular term for religious conversion? That is, they are similar concepts. The assumption is to become the same as what is established, embodied status quo. Could integration limit the full potential of human creativity? And if so, what would be a better term for people's cultural merger to give better well-being?
Yeah, the notion of integration in the acculturation notion would almost certainly have a history in the history of religions. Plural. Different religions would be in the background of the assimilation demand. Even if the assimilation demand looks perfectly secular. Now, when we come to pro-culturation idea, then the integration here means going beyond the social systems that expects assimilation. That means to create a new synthesis, personal or communal synthesis of the particular tradition with a particular, so to say, incoming conditions for the migrant. And from that point of view, that is exactly where the development beyond any religious systems, as well as using doubt-based thinking rather than doubt-free thinking, which is characteristic of most of the religious establishments, not religious belief systems, but establishments, using the doubt-based system for further development. Now, of course, coming from the academic scientific side, it is very easy for us to talk about scientific ideas developing in new ways, new directions in different countries, and so on. What about the very ordinary life person who migrates from Italy to the United States, for example, and opens such a very simple thing as a pizza restaurant. This person is not modifying pizza of Italian side into new form, maybe new, more American version of it and so on. But the person is modifying the whole of the culinary system of America by simply being there and by simply introducing a new particular cuisine. So the innovation that comes with the integration of pro-culturation side could be seen quite interestingly in the societal development of new relevant techniques of everyday life, like restaurants, like food industry, and so on, as a result of cultural innovation, as a result of developing something synthetic, something new that previously was not there, and this develops by linking the incomers tradition, Italian pizza, with something that is now becoming popular in a context of the new place. So in this sense, we all necessarily at all levels of our expertise, academic or everyday life, we are constantly expected to innovate in the way of synthesizing our backgrounds and in the way of demands that our given moment society gives us, economically, professionally, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. You made a very interesting point by saying that integration as institution has a very firm place in the history of religions. This brings me to additional question: are there any social institutions which do not belong to history of religion? I'm following here Durkheimian way of thinking. His concept of society has clear relationship with social consciousness. I mean social consciousness as a way of reintegrating of society. This is exactly religion, and is it right then to say that all social institutions are in a sense religious?
If we look at some basic underlying idea structure of different religions, which at certain moment includes the notion of undoubtable belief in something, then it would be very difficult to find any institution that would not have that in our present-day societies, even the ones that are explicitly fighting any religious backgrounds. Where could we find, if we could find? Probably in very early development of society, where the particular religious systems have not yet emerged. Maybe there we can find that, but I'm not so sure. It's a very important question because it leads us to the interesting tension between religion as a belief system, a multi-structured belief system, and religion as a undoubtable goal of allegiance. The problem is not in our society the presence of religiousness, but the presence of extremist way of turning particular belief systems into undoubtable ones. That's really what I would say would unify all of our present day societal conflicts, which are based on religions, plural. They're not based on religions, they are based on escalation of one or the other of the religious systems into a state where it becomes dominated by undoubtability, no doubt allowed. And then it doesn't matter which religious background we come from, the undoubtability escalation would lead us exactly to the same outcome, which is intolerance as well as potential eradication of the opponents.
Thank you. There is now interesting question from Russell King. I would like to say just to Jaan that Russell is a leading migration scholar of our time. So we have a question from leading migration scholar to leading cultural psychologist. And the question is, in your early slide, you seem to equate migration with mobility, going to school or work or on holiday. For me, this is mobility, not migration. So migration is actually about immobility. It is about moving and then staying put for a certain period of time, such as 6 months or a year, such that you are classified and seen as a migrant. Do you agree?
Well, of course, I would agree, because this is what you would describe is exactly what you would expect in any formal side of societies to use to look at who is a migrant. Yeah? And my goal was just to chart out a wider range, if I could, of different phenomena, and pointing out that psychologically this wider range possibilities give us different ways of psychological issues. I obviously, any society can define a migrant in one way or another, narrower or wider, and of course I honor the migration studies way of defining it. That helps to narrow down the otherwise very wide range of movements, so to say.
Okay, and we have still 3 minutes to go, and then I can pick up one question. It is from Mariana Makarova, and she says it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on the impact of increasing digitalization on migration trends.
Do I have any thoughts on that? I don't actually. But it would be very important. It's a very nice question which needs to be elaborated. Well, let me just add a particular issue. Now, what we're doing right now is an example of this kind of migratory tendency where we all come together in Tallinn without being in Tallinn, most of us. And then that creates a very interesting new community where most of the administrative rules of visas and so on are totally irrelevant. So basically we are migrating without making any move. But the implications of all of that would be still to work out. We have to work out. I have no idea.
Okay, thank you. I think now it is time to conclude. I would like to thank Jaan for your excellent presentation and for your excellent answers. My conclusion from this exchange was that it is extremely important to have this interdisciplinary exchange. You come from cultural psychology. Most of us are from other fields. And this is behind certain differences in emphasis. I think we learned a lot from you. You started from seemingly simple things, but you came into a very deep insights, and I'm sure there is a lot of food for thinking for all of us. Thank you, Jaan, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Raiva, for introduction and final words. Thanks, everybody. All the luck, further luck in your progress.
Thank you. Bye.